Nobody in the valley saw him leave town that morning, but the blacksmith swore he heard him dragging something heavy down the ridge trail before daylight. Said it wasn't a mule or a wagon, just a scraping sound, like steel on rock. Others claimed he'd gone mad weeks earlier, but by the time the worst storm in 20 years buried their cabins roof high and left them cut off from every supply road, the name Josiah Holt was on every trembling settler's tongue, because somewhere beneath all that snow, Josiah was still burning wood, and his smoke was the only thing still rising. It began the way these winters always do, not sudden, not theatrical, just cold enough to whisper warnings that nobody ever listened to. By November, every settler in Wolfbone Valley was chopping, sealing, stockpiling. The town of Far Hollow emptied quick of able-bodied men, each one riding for his own claim, trying to beat the freeze. No one had much time for Josiah. Truth be told, no one ever really had. He'd been a prospector in another life, some said. Others guessed prison. No wife, no children, just that patch of land near Devil's Hollow that nobody wanted, the kind with split boulders and shallow-rooted trees, and a stream that disappeared underground when the sun got low. He came into town once a month, boots scabbed in clay, face half swallowed by beard, trading quiet nods for flour and salt pork. Sometimes he spoke, usually when asked directly, but the words always came out slow and distant, like he'd already answered the question somewhere deeper than here. Nobody noticed at first when he stopped showing up that fall, just figured the freeze had taken him early, or the mountain had finally split open beneath his boots. But then a boy spotted smoke rising near the bluffs, not from a chimney but from the side of the ridge itself, a thin grey finger curling out of a rock face like the earth itself was exhaling, and not just one day, every day, even through the snow. Of course they laughed, called it crazy Josiah's burial smoke, said he probably crawled into a hole and died beside a lit fire, and now his ghost was the one keeping warm. But then came the blizzard. It wasn't forecast. Not that anyone in Wolfbone ever relied on forecasts. The first flurries came hard and mean, and by dawn the mountains had vanished. By the third day the roads were gone, not buried but erased. Trees cracked under ice, roofs sagged, firewood stacks, carefully rationed and tarped through September, were soaked through and frozen solid. Some families hadn't stocked enough, others had, but their chimneys failed. The smoke turned sour, children coughed, dogs froze in their sleep. That's when people remembered the smoke, the steady smoke, the clean smoke, rising out of the earth. Josiah's smoke. There wasn't a soul in Far Hollow who hadn't made some cruel comment about him. Too strange, too quiet, always digging, always carting something down the gulch behind his claim. And when asked, he'd say only one thing: fire runs deeper than most think. They'd called him a hermit, a fool, a danger. But now they called him something else. They called him the only warm man left. Old Caleb Doyle was the first to try. He strapped on snowshoes over frostbitten boots, tucked a pistol under his coat, and left his 2 grandsons curled under blankets, promising to find the smoke. He never made it. His body was found upright in a drift 4 days later, eyes wide open, teeth shattered from clenching. They buried him in ice because they couldn't break ground. After that, no one dared move, except Clara Moffat. She wasn't young, 52 winters behind her, and a shoulder ruined from when her barn collapsed last spring. But she had a granddaughter, May, barely 6, feverish from the cold, lips cracked like dried mud. Clara had buried too many to just sit and wait for the same. She bundled May in all she had, strapped her to her chest with torn bed sheets, and took a hatchet, a lantern, and Josiah's name on her tongue. She walked into snow so thick it erased the world, and she didn't come back that night, or the next. But on the morning of the 5th day, a sound echoed through the valley like something from a storybook, a sharp, splitting crack, followed by a long, low thunder of moving snow. The North Ridge had broken, a natural avalanche, the kind that can wipe out whole trees. But as it settled, the snow revealed something, a shape, not a cabin, not a fire, a hole, a perfect black mouth carved into the cliffside, steam hissing faintly from its edge. 2 figures stumbled from it, one tall, one wrapped in pelts, Clara and the girl. They didn't speak when the town found them, just stood blinking under a dim sky, as if they'd returned from the grave. Their clothes smelled of smoke, not the choking kind of wet logs, but clean, earthy, rich. They were warm, their skin wasn't blue, their breath didn't shake. When someone asked how she survived, Clara said only this: he built a fire cavern. They laughed at first, out of reflex. It sounded like madness, like something you'd say after too long in the cold. But then May reached into her coat and pulled out a stone, smooth, red, and warm to the touch, as if it had just come from a hearth, and their laughter stopped. Clara collapsed after that. Her legs had turned purple from the walk. They couldn't save one foot. But the girl? She was fine. Slept deep, woke calm. She said Josiah never spoke while they stayed, just fed the fire, boiled water from a hole in the wall, and kept adding wood to a deep stone pit that glowed like the inside of an oven. And yet, he never burned more than a single log at a time. They'd lived there for days, underground, in a room carved straight from the rock. It had shelves. It had vents. The floor was clay. The walls stacked stone on stone like bricks laid by a silent hand. Fire never roared, it hummed. The warmth wasn't harsh. It wrapped around you like a second skin. By the time the thaw came, late February, 3 more families had vanished trying to find Josiah's cavern. The smoke kept rising. Some swore they heard voices in the wind. Others said Josiah had sealed the cavern behind Clara, locking himself in. But when the snow finally pulled back enough for a search party, they found the entrance again, or what they thought was the entrance. Only it wasn't a hole anymore. It was a wall, a perfect stone wall set into the ridge. Still warm, still smoking, but silent. No door, no Josiah. Only a faint message scratched into the stone. 8 words that changed how the valley remembered everything. Dig deep, feed slow, fire will remember you. And right then, nobody thought he was crazy anymore. What they couldn't understand was how he'd done it. How a man with no tools, no plans, no help, had carved a warm sanctuary into the frozen ribs of a mountain and kept it alive with so little. But there were rumors, whispers about what he'd been doing all those years dragging junk up the hill, about the forge parts he'd traded for, about the time he spent alone studying the cracks in the ridge, listening to the rocks. There were things he said that people remembered now, things they'd once ignored. Heat travels like water, just gotta give it a river. Clay holds the memory of fire. Smoke that don't rise is smoke that waits. Clara had been inside. She saw the thing he built, but even she admitted it wasn't something just made. It felt older, like he'd uncovered something instead of invented it, like he'd followed heat down a trail no one else had dared to walk. And now the town wanted in, but Josiah was gone, and the fire, it kept burning. By spring, no one in Wolfbone Valley laughed anymore. The thaw brought back the rivers and roads, but it didn't thaw out the shame most folks carried. Shame for the way they'd looked at Josiah Holt, for the way they'd written him off, for the way they'd made jokes about the smoke that had outlasted them all. They buried 13 that winter. 3 froze in their beds. 4 more vanished looking for shelter beyond the pass. 1 child starved when her father, weak and stubborn, insisted they'd survive without begging. The rest died slow. Sickness, exposure, despair. Not all at once, and not heroically. Most passed quietly, the way cold death usually takes a man, in his sleep or somewhere between waking and frostbite. But May Moffat didn't die. Clara didn't die. They'd sat in a fire-warmed cave while the valley turned white and still, and once word spread, the town changed. It began with a map. Clara drew it herself, trembling hands scratching charcoal onto flower paper. She didn't remember every turn, too dark inside, too quiet, but she remembered the slope of the ridge, the direction of the vent shaft, the smell of the mineral in the walls. She remembered the way the floor curved slightly down as they went deeper, and how each chamber seemed to breathe, not creak, not moan. Breathe. The heat didn't come from a fire alone, she insisted. It came from the walls. That was the part no one liked hearing. Folks wanted to believe Josiah had discovered some miracle stove, some long-lost technique, a hidden coal seam. They wanted logic, instructions. But the more she talked, the more it unsettled them. He didn't just light logs, Clara said once, wrapped in a coat too big for her, toe gone from the frost. He listened. He tended to it like it was alive. He tapped the walls with a rod and waited. If it hissed, he added clay. If it popped, he fanned the pit. If it steamed, he murmured. Murmured what? Someone asked. She didn't answer. The search parties came next. Young men and tough women from town, outfitted with rope and pickaxes, set off in 2s and 3s to follow her sketch and find the cavern. Some came back empty-handed, others returned rattled. One man said he found a spot where the snow melted too fast. Another claimed he heard a hum under his feet, like a buried bellows. But no one found the door again, not the way it had looked that day. The stone wall had changed. It was part of the ridge now, sealed, alive, and yet the smoke still rose, that thin, perfect line of grey, curling skyward with no source, no chimney, no draft, always the same. Eventually some tried to dig. Ben Kruger, the trapper who once swore Josiah was touched in the head, led the first real expedition. He brought 3 men, 6 mules, iron rods, and enough food for 2 weeks. They camped right where the smoke had last been spotted and began chipping the rock. He was back in 4 days, gaunt, sunken-eyed, and bleeding from his palms. We found something, he said, or it found us. He didn't say much more, but his men didn't return at all. He claimed they went deeper and wouldn't come out, said the walls changed behind them, said heat started rising from cracks that hadn't been there. He looked ashamed, like someone who'd knocked on a grave. Nobody tried again for months. But something else began to happen then, something stranger than snow or smoke. A few of the older settlers began telling stories, not just about Josiah, but about the ridge, about things they'd half forgotten or never dared say. They talked about strange warmth under certain boulders, of roots that grew twisted toward the rocks, of livestock refusing to graze near Devil's Hollow, of how birds never nested there, of how even in dry seasons that stretch of mountain always smelled faintly of ash, but no one ever saw flames. And then came the letter. It arrived in early June, postmarked from Dead Horse, a 2-day ride west, where Josiah had supposedly been before claiming his parcel. It was addressed to whomever remembers. Me, in an unsteady hand. Clara recognized the script immediately. It was his. No one knew how it had reached them. The postmaster swore it hadn't come through his hands, but there it was, left on the church steps, folded twice, sealed with wax. Inside, just 2 pages. To those still breathing in the valley I once walked, I reckon most won't miss me. That's all right. I was never made for crowds. I watched the way people treated fire, like a tool, a curse, a punishment, never like a friend. Fire saved me more than men ever did. Years ago, I stumbled into a place below the ridge, fell through rotten ground while tracking mule tracks in the rain. Thought I was done for, but the mud gave way to warmth, dry rock. I waited for it to kill me. It didn't, just held me, like the womb of the earth herself. Took me years to understand it, longer to shape it, even longer to trust it. It's not magic, it's memory. The earth remembers heat, clay holds it, stone feeds it, and if you learn how to speak its tongue, it shares. Most will call this foolish, but some of you, the ones who felt it, you'll know, not by proof, but by breath. If you must come looking, dig slow, listen faster, and know this, it's not the fire that will kill you, it's the hunger you bring with it. J.H. The letter was passed from hand to hand, read aloud in the church, debated in the saloon. Some called it a hoax, others called it a confession, but a few, a quiet few, saw it for what it was, a map written in heat and silence. And slowly, quietly, those few began to dig. They didn't go in search of Josiah. They weren't after gold or coal or legend. They wanted warmth, not the kind that roars, the kind that hums, that remembers. So they dug shallow at first, then deeper, always careful, always slow. A carpenter named Eli Weaver found something first, a pocket of warm stone beneath his goat pen. He built a clay dome over it, sealed the seams, and waited. The dome stayed warm, no fire, no fuel, just heat rising from stone. Others followed suit. A widow named Mercy Cobb found a red seam in her cellar and pressed brick around it. Her root cellar stayed thawed while snow piled 5 feet above it. People stopped talking so much. They worked, and slowly a new kind of building began to rise in the valley. Not cabins or barns, but shapes more like kilns, low and round, sunk into hillsides or tucked into glades. Some called them fire bellies. Others called them Josiah Holes. No one agreed on the name, but the heat never left. That winter a storm came again, not as cruel as the last, but cold enough to test every roof. Firewood ran low, chimneys cracked, but the ones who had dug, the ones who listened, stayed warm, even when smoke stopped rising, even when wind howled through shutter gaps. They burned less, they breathed easier, they survived, and still no one saw Josiah again. Children began telling stories, that he walked the fire underneath them, that he spoke through clay, that his boots were made of stone and he never aged. Some said he was dead, others said he'd never been alive the way they were. But Clara, now older, now slower, would smile when she heard those tales. She knew the truth, even if she couldn't explain it. He didn't dig a shelter, she told May one morning. He made a covenant. And May, grown now, her hair tied back in a miner's knot, nodded. She'd begun digging her own chamber, with care, with silence, and with faith. Because in Wolfbone Valley, fire was no longer something you struck with steel and tinder. It was something you earned, and it was always waiting. The valley changed in ways no one put to paper. It wasn't dramatic, not overnight, but something beneath the crust of Wolfbone shifted in spirit as surely as the frost shifted stone. The old men who once barked orders at the general store started listening more, watching more. Not just the sky, not the game trails or snow line. They watched the earth. They listened to it in a way that made their grandchildren stare. They rapped their knuckles on their walls and said things like, "That timber's holding heat wrong." They stared at their cellars and muttered about cold ghosts in the clay. They dug not to escape cold, but to speak to it. And below all their words, one name hummed under the breath of the town. Josiah. Every boy and girl knew the story. They all pointed up to Devil's Hollow with its rugged cliff face and whispered about the day the smoke stopped, about the cavern that opened, took in a woman and child, and gave them back warm when the rest of the world was frostbitten blue. There was a kind of reverence to the way they said his name now. Josiah Holt, once a mad loner with mud-stained boots, now whispered about like a prophet or a ghost, and yet nobody saw him, not even once. Years passed. The stone wall where Clara emerged never opened again. The smoke didn't rise anymore. The earth healed over like a wound gone flat. But the heat didn't vanish. It simply withdrew, quietly, like it was watching. It was May who found the second cavern, and she wasn't even looking. By then she was 17, strong-limbed, quiet, with the same kind of stare Josiah used to give. Not unkind, but far off, like she was half present in some other place more real than this one. She kept to herself, same as her grandmother had since that winter. But she'd taken to walking the slopes alone with a hammer and ear trumpet fashioned from a bit of stovepipe. Folks called her strange for it, not cruelly, not like they did Josiah. Just wary. She listens to rocks, they said, like she's waiting for one to talk back. Maybe one did. May was walking a ridge above her family's property. When she paused by a sheer cliffside no one thought much of, just dry shale, brittle and grey, brittle enough to break if you pressed your thumb into the right spot. She rapped on it once, then again. Said later she felt the thump travel through her elbow like a heartbeat. She leaned down, pressed the trumpet to the cliff, and listened. Then she vanished for 3 days. Her grandmother nearly died waiting, sent men up the slope to look for signs, but snow began to fall that night, and the trail disappeared. They found her on the 4th morning, stumbling back into the clearing, skin pink with heat, clothes soaked in steam. She carried nothing, said nothing, just went to bed and slept for a day and a night. When she woke she drew a map. It was crude but clear, a straight shaft down through soft shale, then a bend into dry loam, then down again into a hollow space that echoed like a pipe organ. No fire, no light, but heat, steady, and humming like a heart inside stone ribs. She said it felt alive but not threatening, not a furnace, a cradle. Eli Weaver and 2 others followed her map. They found it, just where she said it would be, behind a patch of shale that flaked like crust. One good strike and the opening gave way, revealing a tunnel lined with red clay and what looked like hand-shaped stones. They walked for 15 yards before their lanterns began to flicker. Not out, just odd, like the flame was struggling to choose a direction. Then the heat hit them, not burning, not even hot, just dense, like a warm fog wrapping their skin, pressing gently on their lungs. It smelled like stone after a rain, earthy and faintly metallic. They stayed only minutes before retreating, shaken but unharmed. The next day, Eli boarded up the entrance, said it wasn't time yet, said something deeper was waiting. That winter tested everyone. The fire caverns folks had built, crude ones, half modeled after Clara's memory, half from guesswork, began to struggle. Clay cracked, drafts formed. Some vents hissed too loud, others failed to vent at all, choking rooms with slow poison. A child died in a kiln dome when the flue collapsed. Another family barely made it out when steam pressure burst a wall during supper. Wolfbone Valley remembered that fire was a living thing, and living things, mistreated, bite back, so they stopped digging for a time. May didn't. She kept walking the ridges, sometimes for days, leaving copper markers hammered into trees and always returning with another scratch of a map, another stone warmed by her pocket. She spoke less than ever, and she never forced her way in. She just listened, dug small, patched with care. Some swore she started talking in her sleep, mumbling in a language nobody could place, but always while wrapped in a warm blanket with a stone near her chest. By then, the valley had changed so much that newcomers thought it'd always been that way. New cabins had rounded hearths. Most had at least one sunken room made of clay and vented upward through kiln flue techniques no book ever described. People started training their children in heat watching, teaching them to gauge fire's behavior by how stone turned color, how ash curled, how breath fogged in corners. They named things after Josiah, Holt Ridge, Josiah's mouth, the Holt method. And May, they didn't call her strange anymore. They called her the listener. Then came the quake. It wasn't large, no lives were lost, but the entire northern ridge cracked with a thunder like God's fist had struck the sky. Boulders tumbled, smoke rose where no fire had burned in years. The old wall, the one Clara emerged from, split in half down the center, but there was no chamber behind it, just blackness. And in the middle of it all, standing still in the falling snow, was a man, tall, wrapped in soot-black cloth, bare-handed. His beard was long and red with dust, his eyes deep and slow. No one recognized him, not at first, but Clara Moffat, nearly blind now, stepped forward through the crowd and didn't hesitate. She took his hand. "Josiah," she said, voice cracking like the ridge. He didn't speak, just nodded, then turned and walked back into the shadowed split behind him. Not a door, not a room, but a vein in the mountain. And before anyone could move, the stone folded shut, like it had never opened. Only one thing was left outside, a single log, wrapped in red clay, hollowed and carved with markings no one recognized. Not letters, not symbols, but the kind of grooves you'd find in driftwood, rubbed by the tide for 50 years. It steamed gently in the snow. May picked it up, and she understood. The next week, they built a chamber, not by plan, but by instinct. May oversaw it. She didn't shout or command. She simply walked and stopped, walked and tapped, pressed her ear to the earth and nodded. The men dug, the women laid brick, the children hauled clay and water. They shaped it like a bowl, not a box, curved, deep, sealed. Then, in its heart, they placed the log. It lit itself. No flint, no match, just breath, like the fire had been waiting. And for 4 days, the room stayed warm, without another log added. They cooked over it, slept beside it, wept near it. Some said the air whispered, others heard nothing, but all agreed it wasn't fire they felt. It was memory, of warmth, of mercy, of a man once called mad, who never asked to be understood, only followed. That chamber still stands. It burns now only in winter, never in summer, and never without listening first. Because they've learned, in Wolfbone Valley, fire is not kind, but it is fair, and if you dig with arrogance, it leaves. But if you listen with need, it remembers you. By the 4th winter after Josiah Holt's return, if that's what you'd call it, though he never spoke, never stayed, the valley was no longer just surviving. It was breathing differently, slowly, deeper, like something buried beneath its ridges had awakened in full. And while other mountain towns struggled to rebuild from fires, storms, or the steady rot of bad planning and worse, Pride, Wolfbone began to draw people in, quietly, steadily, never in floods, just one family at a time. They came not for gold, not even for land. They came for warmth, not the warmth of chimneys or thick quilts, but the kind you couldn't explain in words. Stories leaked beyond the valley, stories of homes heated by hollow stones, of rooms that stayed warm all winter without a single fresh log, of fire that burned clean and slow, as if it was part of the ground itself. Some dismissed it all as superstition, others called it old miners' lies. But the ones who'd suffered a cold death before, the ones who'd buried children beneath frost, they listened, they came. And when they came, May met them. She had grown in the years since the quake, not taller, not louder, but deeper somehow, in the way a river carves quiet grooves into rock. Her presence no longer unsettled townsfolk. Now it comforted them. Even when she said nothing at all, she taught the newcomers how to listen, not with ears, not only, with breath, with patience, with a kind of surrender most people in the world had forgotten how to offer. They'd ask, "How deep should we dig?" And she'd answer, "That depends on what you're willing to lay down." They'd ask, "Is there fire in every ridge?" And she'd shrug, "Only where it's wanted." At first, people found that maddening. They wanted plans, blueprints, instructions. But the ones who stayed, the ones who really stayed, began to feel it. One settler, Emery James, found it under his horse paddock, of all places, a spot where the ground never fully froze. Another, a widow from Dry Creek, said she'd dreamt of warmth beneath her kitchen. And when her son dug there, they found red clay soaked in steam. No coal, no heat source, just warmth, waiting. Those who dug without reverence, they found nothing, or worse. There were stories of caverns that filled with gas, others that echoed with strange sounds, pressure changes, even whispers. One man swore a fire bellied out too strong, melted his pots, boiled his water, and then hissed back into nothing when he cursed at it. May didn't scold them. She never scolded. She just said, "You cannot force warmth. You can only welcome it." And people began to believe her. That's when the letters started. They came in bundles, from places no one had thought of in years. From Larkspur Ridge, from Scalding Bone, even as far as Trough Bend, 6 days' ride through treacherous snow and shadowy timber. All handwritten, all asking for guidance. Is the fire real? Do you sell the logs? Can we visit the chambers? May read each one, then burned them all in the oldest pit they had, the one where Josiah's carved log still glowed faintly in the right moonlight, not as rejection, but as offering. She said the answers weren't in ink, they were in the ground. And so, once a year, just before the first hard frost, she led what came to be known as the listening walk. Anyone was welcome, though only a few ever joined. They'd walk in silence from the center of town up to Devil's Hollow and back again, stopping at 12 marked stones along the way, each chosen by May over the years. At each stone they'd kneel, press ear to soil, wait. Some heard nothing, some wept. A few returned different, not in a way most could explain, just quieter, more patient, like warmth had been planted inside them. That winter, a man arrived no one recognized, dressed in fine wool, polished boots, skin pale like he hadn't seen real sun in years. He carried a roll of maps and 2 assistants who wore gloves indoors, called himself Hollis Thorne, said he was from Denver, said he was interested in the geothermal phenomena of the valley. No one answered him, not for the first few days. He asked questions at the general store, got silence, asked again at the saloon, got cold looks. When he pushed further, when he started walking up ridges with notebooks and instruments, the townsfolk started watching. May never spoke to him directly. She didn't have to. People took it upon themselves to slow him down. They invited him for meals that ran long, sent him up paths that circled back on themselves, fed him half-truths like breadcrumbs into a hollow maze. He didn't understand, and that made him angry. "Don't you people want progress?" he snapped one night at the saloon. "Don't you want to build, share this, harness it?" But nobody answered, because Wolfbone had already learned what happens when you try to harness something that lives deeper than understanding. By the 3rd week, Thorne was angry enough to dig. He hired a pair of rough men from out of town, promised them pay and warm shelter, and led them up to the western ridge where the old steam stones had been found. They struck hard, fast, with steel drills and chemicals, even used blasting powder when the wall resisted. The boom woke the town, and for a moment it seemed nothing would happen, just scorched trees and shattered rock. But then, from beneath the ridge came the sound, not a roar, not a collapse, a wail, long, low, like something ancient mourning in its sleep. And then the steam came, not white, not clean, black, hissing, hot enough to melt snow before it touched ground. It rose fast, spread faster. The ridge burned red for 3 days. No fire, not visible, just heat, pouring up from the wound like blood from a vein sliced too deep. Thorne's men were never found. Thorne himself survived, barely, found days later wandering south, shoes melted, face blistered, muttering about doors that shut behind him, about the walls breathing, about something staring from the clay. He never came back. The ridge sealed itself again. No one dug there after that. May didn't say, "I told you so." She just laid new stones to mark it off. Then she took the town children up the opposite ridge, where warmth rose slow and steady near the river bend, and began teaching them how to build a listening chamber of their own. Not a furnace, not a shelter, a covenant, one brick at a time, one breath at a time. Some called it religion, others called it stewardship, but nobody argued anymore. Not after the black steam, not after the wail. That spring a child was born in the chamber. No fire was lit, no cloths burned, but the warmth was steady. The mother, a girl who once scorned the valley ways, wept afterward, said she never felt pain, only a hum, deep inside her ribs, like someone holding her from within. They named the boy Josiah, not Holt, just Josiah, and when he opened his eyes, May placed a small red stone in his palm. The warmth didn't rise, it settled, and the valley held its breath. Spring in Wolfbone Valley was never warm, not in the way the lowlands knew it. There were no honey breezes, no cherry blossoms or fresh mud. It was a quieter spring, one that melted snow slowly, that pried open the frozen mouth of the river with a groan, that lifted the fog just enough for men to see what had survived and what hadn't. But that spring, the spring after the black steam and the stillbirth of another mining town 20 miles south, something different passed through the valley. It wasn't sunlight, it was belief, not the loud kind, not tents or sermons or bonfires, but the kind that lingers in hands, in choices, in silence, the kind that rewrites a people without ever declaring itself. More families arrived that year, some with nothing but old mules and the memory of colder places. They didn't come to pan for gold or build rail. They came for the stories, for the warmth, for the hum they'd heard whispered in the mouths of other travelers. They came for fire that remembered. And May, now 20, now with crow's feet forming where a girl's softness used to be, welcomed them with the same gaze Josiah once gave to strangers. Unflinching, unjudging, unreadable. She no longer explained. Those who needed to be told would never stay. But those who came with nothing but reverence, those who came with their heads bent to the earth, those she taught with gestures, with stillness, with example. No written words, no lessons carved in stone, just rhythm, the rhythm of digging slow, of patting clay soft, of sealing seams in the silence of dusk. They watched, and they learned, and those who hurried never made it far. It was Josiah, the boy, who brought the fire back. He was 3 when he first vanished from the house, barefoot in frost, wandered off while his mother swept the ash from the hearth. No one knew where he'd gone. Panic struck fast. It always did in the valley, ever since the blizzard years, and half the town searched. They combed the ridges, checked every pit, every shaft, every root cellar. They found him just before dark, sitting cross-legged beside a slate outcrop on the east ridge, not shivering, not crying, just warm. A ring of melted snow circled him, steam rising off the dirt like breath. He looked up and said, "She told me where to sit." They asked who. He said, "The warm woman." Some chuckled nervously, writing it off as childish talk. Others looked at May. She didn't smile. She simply walked up, placed a hand on the slate, closed her eyes, and nodded once. Then she turned and said, "Mark this place." They built no chamber there, not yet. Instead, May instructed them to wait. "Some warmth isn't for shelter," she said. "Some is only for remembering." The town obeyed. That's what they did now. Not out of fear, not from blind trust, but from the accumulated memory of survival. May had led them through 4 winters. She'd never once buried a soul in frost. They listened. Even the mayor, a title now more symbolic than political, took his cues from her. There were no more elections, no votes, just shared breath. A knowing. This wasn't civilization, not in the old way. It was something older. That summer, a new voice came through the mountains. Not a man, not a settler. A voice on the wind, scratchy, static-laced, faint as a whisper, but undeniable. Someone had set up a wire line through the pass, likely connected to a rail town down near Carson's Bluffs, and now through an old box radio half buried in the trading post, they could hear the world again. At first they ignored it, but May insisted they listen, once a week for a single hour. The stories were frightening. Whole towns gone hollow from flood and plague, regions where coal dust choked lungs and burned homes, talk of thermal power, and men digging into the belly of the Rockies with machines that crush stone like bread crusts. They spoke of domestic energy revolutions and geothermal infrastructure. They spoke of fire like a thing to be bought, bottled, traded. And then they mentioned Wolfbone, just in passing, a field report, unexplained heating anomalies in western ridges, possible geothermal pocket, no viable extraction planned until next thaw. May said nothing, but her jaw tightened and her eyes turned toward the hills. They waited. Winter came late that year, but when it came with strangers. 2 trucks, black and silent, crawling up the pass just ahead of the snow. Men in suits, 6 of them, clean-shaven, no mules, no boots, no shovels. They asked no questions, carried cameras, scanned ridges. They pitched no tents, took no meals, just walked, and where they walked, the ground changed, not visibly, not violently. But those who listened, the old ones, the children, May, they felt it, like a pulse fading, like breath holding. The warmth went thin in certain places. Fire pits that once hummed now whispered. May stood on the ridge one morning, watching them through a glass scope. She never approached, but she didn't need to. On the 7th night, the men vanished. Trucks gone, no tire marks, no word, only a stone, left on the church steps, smooth, black, cold. May crushed it beneath her heel. That was the night the earth spoke again. It wasn't sound, not to most, but the warmth returned, stronger. Not in every pit, in some, new ones, old ones, quiet corners long forgotten by even the oldest settlers. It was as though the valley had shifted its bloodline, changed its current. Josiah, the boy, not the man, woke screaming at midnight, sweat pouring, fists clenched. When they calmed him, he said, "She moved the fire." No one asked who she was anymore. Some things were not names. Some things were breath itself. May gathered the town the next day, all of them, from the oldest trapper to the newest widow. She stood barefoot in frost on the stone steps of the trading post and said only this, "We are not alone in our warmth, but we are not its masters." Then she pointed to the western ridge, where the black stone had first steamed, where Josiah Holt had vanished after his final return. "We do not dig there again," she said. "We do not whisper to that place. We do not call it." Someone asked quietly, "Then what do we do if they come back?" May's answer came like stone falling. "Burn slow, breathe deep, and be ready to seal the ground." No one argued. They rebuilt every pit that winter, not for comfort, for defense, not with fear, but respect. They began to use new bricks, darker ones, made of a mixture only May understood. Clay, ash, bone dust. The warmth stayed. It stayed clean, strong. It circled them like a low fire around a sleeping camp, and they waited, in the silence, in the hum, for whatever would come next. They say you don't feel a change while it's happening, only afterward, when the old way feels absurd, and the new way feels like breath. That was Wolfbone by the 6th year. The wind still came cold, and snow still carved its teeth down the ridges, but the people no longer feared it, because beneath their boots, fire walked with them, and fire remembered. The pits weren't called fire caverns anymore, not officially. Some still said the name in reverence, whispering it at night when the earth's hum was strongest, but most had let it become a way of life. Not a marvel, not a mystery, just truth. You dug slow, You shaped with care. You listened, and when the heat came, you thanked it. You didn't chain it. You never struck flint without first breathing in. That's what it meant to survive. But survival, May always said, was just the beginning. Surviving meant knowing what not to do. Living, real living, meant building something that could outlast you. That winter came late and warm. The trees clung to their leaves well into November. Even the animals behaved strangely. Bears didn't burrow. Birds didn't flee. Some said the land was warning them. May said nothing. She'd grown quieter than ever and more distant. Still only 24, but she looked older now, with deep-set eyes that didn't blink fast and hands that stayed warm even when snow clung to her coat. She stopped leading the listening walk, passed it to Josiah, the boy. He was 6, tall for his age, and already carried that same stillness Josiah Holt once did. The same way of pausing before he spoke, of letting a question land and stretch before giving it shape. He didn't answer questions the way most boys did. If you asked, "Where's your mother?" he'd say, "By the river's breath." If you asked, "Is the fire hot?" he'd say, "It's awake." And if you asked what he meant, he'd go quiet, like your words didn't match the music he heard. Some children are echoes. He was a bell. By then, there were 57 structures in the valley, and nearly all had some kind of pit. The older ones were rebuilt. The newer ones had fire-born stone at their core. The town no longer drew maps. It drew lines in the earth. May called them threads. She showed Josiah how to trace them, how to feel for breath in the loam, how to mark shifts in soil scent, how to listen with his hands. Others wanted to learn, but she only taught him, not out of selfishness. She simply said, "It needs only one voice to speak." Then came the caravan. 9 wagons, 12 men, 2 steam rigs, flags flying. Not military, worse, a company. No one knew the name. The sigil was new, but they came with ledgers and maps, and a surveyor's pride. One had a cane with gold on the handle. Another wore gloves even in sleep. They smiled too much, ate alone, tied their mules too tight. They called themselves guests, but everyone knew better. They weren't here for cattle, not lumber. They were here for heat. They asked polite questions at first, about local mining ordinances, mineral rights, heat vents. They offered terms, nothing so crude as a bribe, but always with the stink of transaction. May didn't meet with them. She didn't need to, because Josiah stood on the church steps the 3rd day they arrived, pale hair glowing in the winter haze, and said plainly, "She's not yours to measure." The men laughed. Then they heard the hum. They said it was an echo at first, just wind, but it followed them, through the trees, down the trails, even into their wagons. A low, almost musical vibration, not audible to all, but felt like the drum of blood behind your ears when you lie still too long. It made the coffee taste like clay. It made their firewood hiss. It made one of their horses refuse water and eventually drop dead. On the 5th day, their lead engineer went missing. They found him near the first chamber Josiah Holt ever dug, kneeling by the collapsed ridge. His hands were buried to the wrists in warm dirt. He wasn't frozen. He wasn't burned. He was still, eyes open, face peaceful, as if listening to something too quiet for the rest of the world. The company left at first light. They didn't return. No more trucks, no more suits, only rumors. That summer, May disappeared. No storm, no warning. She walked into the hills one night after whispering something in Josiah's ear, and that was the last anyone saw of her. No trail, no prints, no goodbye. Just her coat, folded neatly beside the main fire pit. A piece of black stone set atop it. Not cold, not warm, just there. Josiah didn't weep. He didn't speak for 3 days. Then on the 4th morning, he stood up, walked to the ridge above Devil's Hollow, and began digging. Not a shaft, not a chamber, just a line. A long, shallow groove across the slope, the kind of channel you might carve to direct water or breath. No one interrupted him. Children gathered at first, then adults. By sundown, the entire town watched him dig that path, slow and silent, the earth parting like it wanted to obey. He laid no stone, he built no roof, but by dusk, heat rose from it. Not fire, heat, a windless warmth, soft, familiar. He stood at the far end and spoke, not loudly, but every ear heard. "She's moved again. This is where we begin." And they followed. The groove became a path. The path became a line. The line became a memory. They began building not chambers now, but veins, long, curved hollows, lined with fire-born clay, branching out like fingers beneath the homes, connecting warmth across the valley. The fire didn't roar, it pulsed. They didn't feed it with logs anymore. Just breath, just presence. Sometimes a stone, sometimes a word. It asked little, but it gave much. Josiah became the new voice of the valley. Not a mayor, not a priest, just a boy who listened deeper than most. He never left, and the valley never froze again. They say if you walk Wolfbone today, If you press your ear to the earth on the right night, in the right place, you'll hear it still. That hum, that slow, steady breath of warmth. Not man-made, not stolen, given, a fire that remembers. And somewhere beneath the oldest ridge, in a chamber no tool could map, there's a man with red in his beard and ash on his hands, still shaping stone, still feeding the fire with his silence. Josiah Holt, crazy no longer, just warm, forever,